If it's Monday, a shifting dynamic in the Republican race for president as Tim Scott gains momentum in the polls, Ron DeSantis struggles, and Donald Trump awaits a potential third indictment. Plus, widespread protests erupt in Israel as Prime Minister Netanyahu's judicial overhaul plan passes a key hurdle in Parliament amid growing turmoil and fresh fallout with the White House. And the border battles heat up in Texas, where Republican Governor Greg Abbott is daring the Biden administration to take him to court over the deployment of controversial floating barriers in the Rio Grande. And welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles, in today for Kristen Welker. And for the first time in really a long time, we have something of a new dynamic emerging in the Republican presidential primary. With Donald Trump awaiting another criminal indictment, Ron DeSantis trying to reboot a struggling campaign, and now Tim Scott apparently on the verge of a breakout moment in the field. The South Carolina senator is up to 11% in an Iowa poll out over the weekend. The only other candidate besides Donald Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to crack double digits in the first caucus state. He's also at 10% in another early state, his home state of South Carolina. He trails only Trump, DeSantis, and the state's former governor, Nikki Haley. Perhaps related, it comes as the Scott campaign and the super PAC supporting him have unloaded a combined $3.1 million to get his message out over the airwaves this month. It's a pretty big number in just over 3 weeks. And there's more on the way, with NBC News reporting that the pro-Scott super PAC Trust in the Mission has reserved $40 million of TV and digital ad spots through January, on top of $7 million that it's already booked. And if you want proof that the Scott bump is real, well, take a look at his rivals. Politico reporting that PACs associated with DeSantis and Haley are now starting to beef up their opposition research into the South Carolina senator. We'll have more on that in just a moment. But folks, even with Scott's apparent momentum, the field is really dwarfed by the elephant in this room of Republicans, and that is, of course, Donald Trump. It's still largely a race for runner-up, as the former president is still dominating in the early polls, this despite 2 criminal indictments and likely a third on the way. We've got a lot to talk about here, so we're just going to kick things off with our panel. Joining me on set, Mark Murray, the NBC News senior political editor and the co-author of the First Read newsletter. Tia Mitchell is a Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Faiz Shakir, a senior advisor to Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders, and Republican strategist Jim Dornan. So let's talk numbers. And so if we talk numbers, we've got to go to you first, Mark. The Fox News poll with these 2 key early states of Iowa and South Carolina. And if you take a look at the numbers, obviously, it's still Donald Trump's to lose. He's out by a wide, wide margin. But you see Tim Scott emerging in both of these 2 polls, both Iowa and South Carolina. He's now cracked double digits. How is it that Scott found himself in this position? Yeah, so the advertising has played a role. As we ended up writing in our First Read newsletter, he's now spent more than $3 million along with the super PAC over the last 3 weeks. And that's a lot of money when you're in the early states of Iowa and New Hampshire to be able to do it. And he's, as the campaign puts it to me, he's been able to do it on his own terms. When you're actually launching your own bio spots and not being attacked, and the other pieces of news are another potential indictment for Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis' campaign is lagging, that all of a sudden that creates an opening to be the chief alternative to the chief alternative we always thought was Ron DeSantis. Right. And so it's money, it's attention, and then it all kind of sets up that debate that we're going to end up seeing a month from now, whether or not Donald Trump gets on the stage, that Tim Scott seems to be a person that the spotlight is going to potentially be on him. And $40 million is a lot of money, though, and that certainly will have an impact. Can he keep that level of spending up over the long term? Well, so that certainly opens eyes. And that $40 million, it's important to note, goes in through next year. And already the super PAC before that $40 million was going to spend about $7 million through the end of this summer. Right. And so that is a lot of money in places like it's plenty of money to introduce yourself to voters. I think the question comes, once you end up getting that scrutiny, panels like us are starting to talk about him. Sometimes those numbers start to go down. They either go up or they go down. Yeah, right. So, Tia, let's talk about South Carolina. This is a state where we would expect Scott to do well. The voters know him there. He's a known quantity. He's always won by wide margins. Is it just the fact that he's from South Carolina, or is this indicative of kind of a wider bit of momentum behind Scott's campaign?
Well, I think the South Carolina polling is so interesting because we know there are two candidates from South Carolina. Former Ambassador Nikki Haley is who's polling second right now after former President Trump. So I do think, in South Carolina, they know him. They're used to voting for him. He's won statewide in South Carolina. So it makes sense that he's doing pretty well in that state. But I think it is still notable that compared to the other South Carolina candidate, he's still a little bit further down, which again is the concern. How far can Tim Scott actually rise in these early states?
I mean, it's kind of a broader example of the problem with the Republican primary field sans Donald Trump is that they're all kind of eating their own and it really kind of on display fully in South Carolina. So, Jim, and Mark kind of alluded to this a little bit, this is going to be Scott now kind of front and center. He's a known quantity, but for the most part, no one has really attacked him in any way, shape, or form. Will he be able to withstand the scrutiny that's certain to come now that he's started to make some gains?
I truly believe that he can. And first of all, he's got a great story, single family or single mom raised up, what do you say, caught in a congressman. That's beautiful. I mean, he's the perfect Republican, in my opinion, and the best out of this group, in my opinion, as well. I think that and he's great retail. And he's, frankly, if you've met him, he's one of the nicest men I've ever met in my life, who's also a U.S. Senator. So I like him. I mean, I think he would represent the party very well. And I think once he gets attacked, for real, that he'll respond accordingly and probably with a smile.
Well, I want to press you a little bit about a specific area where he could face some Republican scrutiny, and that's the effort that he made with Senator Cory Booker to try and find some consensus on police reform. He was pressed on that in a town hall in New Hampshire on Friday. Listen to how he responded.
I believe that police reform failed because there were too many folks on Cory's side of the aisle that were more interested in the issue than the solution. We will never negotiate your qualified immunity, your liability. It's like saying there's a shooting, you go figure out how to solve the problem there, but if you do it wrong, we're taking your house and your pension.
So will Republican primary voters reward him for standing strong in their mind during that negotiation, or will he be penalized for even engaging in the topic at all?
No, I think he had to, and he was a leader, obviously, on our side of the aisle for doing it, and frankly, I think he did a pretty good job. He pulled out the best time he could have, because Booker was moving towards, I believe, defunding the police, and that's where Senator Scott drew the line. So I think he'll probably get attacked by the other Republican candidates, but ultimately, this is going to be about the economy and probably immigration to a certain extent. And he's just good on the issues. I mean, the guy comes across like a very, very smart politician.
All right, Faiz, we're going to work in the conversation, I promise. We've got to go to Garrett Haake
Sorry
here.
about that.
We've got to go to Garrett Haake because we're going to talk about the Republican frontrunner now. And Garrett Haake is the latest from Trump world as we continue to keep an eye out for a potential indictment. So, Garrett, the sure sign of an indictment would seem to be the volume of posting that Donald Trump has done on his social media platform. He was very busy this weekend. What is he saying?
No, and it's not just on his social media platform. He's also been blasting out fundraising emails with largely the same topic here, Ryan. The former president's been attacking the DOJ and the special counsel relentlessly. He describes it as election interference, which we've all heard before, the idea of a stolen election. This weekend debuting a new attack line accusing Jack Smith and Merrick Garland as serving as campaign managers for the Biden re-election campaign. This is not a legal strategy, obviously, but it is a pretty functional political strategy. It reinforces his position as the front runner, making everything about a matchup between he and Joe Biden. And it's an effort to stoke the fundraising base of his most loyal supporters, keep pumping in those small dollar donations. The attack from the, kind of radical left, as he puts it, is continuing. So too must the donations to help him fight it off.
Okay, Garrett, thank you for that update. We appreciate it. Let's go back to the panel now. Mark, Tia, Faiz, and Jim. So to Garrett's point, Faiz, it does appear, at least up until now, that the indictments have helped Donald Trump on some level. But we are starting to see some of his Republican opponents kind of highlight this as potentially a problem. Listen to what Nikki Haley had to say on CNBC this morning.
I will tell you, you look at these indictments, there's probably going to be a fourth indictment. Right. We can't have, as Republicans, him as the nominee. He can't win a general election. That's the problem. We've got to go and have someone who can actually win.
So other than Chris Christie, we haven't seen too many of the Republicans stake themselves out on that ground, which would seem to be conventional wisdom that it wouldn't be good to have a major party candidate with an indictment or several indictments looming over him. Faiz, are Republican primary voters ever going to see that?
The most important numbers in the poll, Ryan, were that it was at 46 and 48. Trump's numbers were. And if he stays at 46 or 48, everyone else is playing for second place, and that's nice. Tim Scott, kudos to you, a silver medal. But I think that, you know, with 40, we went up against Joe Biden. He was never at like a 46 or 48, maybe very early in the race, but like he was coming down, right? High 30s, mid 30s, and you had a shot. If you have 46, 48, it's over. I think that the question for Republican voters and those who are never Trumpers or people who want somebody besides Trump is that, are there Republican voters who think of general election concerns, that the practical, pragmatic choice of who's the best candidate to defeat Joe Biden? In the Democratic primary, I would argue it's what did us in. I mean, we tried as best as we could. You remember attending Bernie Beats Trump rallies. Yep. We were trying to make this argument that we were we were a stronger candidate than Joe Biden. But ultimately, what did us in is that people thought, well, Joe Biden's actually a safer bet. Right. And there were enough of those voters, a large number of those voters, in the Democratic primary. I'm not sure that they exist in the Republican primary. And somebody's got to convince me otherwise, but I have not seen those numbers. I mean, Trump would not be polling as high as he is right now because he's irrational. He's an irrational candidate. Right. He's, in many ways, the weakest candidate in the Republican field, and yet the strongest candidate in the Republican field.
I'm putting you on the spot here a bit, Mark, but do the numbers bear that out, that these Republican primary voters believe that Donald Trump is electable, despite what the conventional wisdom would tell us?
Absolutely, yes. And so our polls actually asked it a certain way. It was like, do you think that Donald Trump should remain the leader of the Republican Party? And to the point that Faiz is making, it was like, yeah, it's about 48 to 50% of Republican primary voters saying yes. And in a multi-candidate field, that 48 to 50% is a big number. Now, it's a fighting chance for somebody if you get it to a two-person race, but it's not a two-person race right now. The other thing that you end up seeing, that our poll ends up saying, you know, about 60% of Republicans say, you know what, it's important to stand behind Donald Trump. What's happening to him is a Democratic witch hunt, versus about 20 to 30% says, no, we need to find a stronger general election candidate. So, no, Faiz is exactly right. From the polling that I've seen, I think the thing that we need to be very humble about is, after the third indictment, after the fourth indictment, does that 48, 50% start going to 38 to 40, and then it becomes a different game?
And a debate, too. We haven't seen that either. So, Tia, it's probably not a good sign for Ron DeSantis that we're not talking about him until this stage of our conversation. But we are going to bring him in, and we're also not going to talk about an issue that's probably very productive for him. He's in a kind of a backlash with the Florida Board of Education over these new standards regarding controversial language having to do with slavery. I want to play for you what the current Vice President Kamala Harris had to say about this curriculum. Take a listen.
How is it that anyone could suggest that in the midst of these atrocities, that there was any benefit to being subjected to this level of dehumanization?
I mean, I didn't do it, and I wasn't involved in it, but I think what they're doing is, I think that they're probably going to show some of the folks that eventually parlayed, you know, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life. And these were scholars who put that together. It was not anything that was done politically.
So I didn't do it, but actually I don't think it's that bad of an idea. Tia, I mean, what's the thinking here?
I don't think he's thought through it. And that, to me, that answer being, you know, passing the buck, not taking responsibility. He's taking responsibility for every other quote unquote anti-woke policy that has come out of Florida. But on this, which is probably the most problematic of them all of a sudden he's saying I had no involvement, and he's kind of throwing his education department that he appoints those board members, throwing them under the bus. And it's coming across weak. It's coming across that he doesn't have a clear answer on this. And quite frankly, he's not going to satisfy the critics, but those on the right who maybe want him to go all in on, you know, rejiggering how we look at slavery, they're probably not satisfied with his answer either.
Right. Jim, you laughed when we played the soundbite and said leadership. I assume that was sarcastic, but expand on your thinking.
It was. I find this just mind-boggling that you would support something like this. It is awful. I mean, it's degenerating. I just can't imagine it. I'm flabbergasted by somebody actually pushing this forward as a policy. I mean, it's begging for the criticism that he's getting, and it's going to get worse, frankly.
Well, on the other side of this, though, Faz, we see the vice president, Kamala Harris, coming out forcefully against this in what seemed to be a very comfortable space for her. Yeah. She was ready to go on the attack.
Put it on the tee for her.
Exactly. Is this where she could play a very important role for the Biden team?
And I hope she does more of this. I think I've believed of Joe Biden. I certainly believe of Kamala Harris that when they're in fighting mode, when there's friction, when they've got foils to go up against, they're at their best. And sometimes I know that this administration is trying to govern and try to dial down the temperature and try to find peaceable ways to the center. Fine. But in this mode right now, you've got to call out some spades and find some people who animate your values. It's not just to punch. It's to say, we have a real different view of how America should be run. That's that over there. You go in that direction if you want to be in the minority with 33%, or you live with us in the majority who want a better future for our kids to live in.
And Mark, there have been a smattering of polls that have shown Biden and Harris kind of starting to bleed a little bit with independent voters. Are flashpoints like this something where they could build back some of that trust with independent voters?
It's always helpful when you're the incumbent president or also the incumbent vice president, and then you're having a matured primary on the other side, and they're starting to beat each other up. We've seen this. We saw this for Barack Obama in the 2012 cycle. We even saw it for Donald Trump as well, too, that, you know, all of a sudden when people start, every single statement that you end up having gets scrutinized, gets attacked, it actually ends up helping the other side of the party. I did find it really interesting, too, and Faz is exactly correct. This is in Kamala Harris's, the vice president's wheelhouse, but it was also interesting that they were going at the guy who's number 2 in the polls, stagnating in the low 20s. And, you know, the Biden campaign has always been built on, well, you know, we're the best to be able to defeat Donald Trump. And it seems like not only is that an easy, low-hanging fruit, but it also kind of ensures that you end up getting that Donald Trump versus Joe Biden matchup that the people in the White House seem to want more.
Yeah, great. Terrific conversation, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. Mark, Tia, Faz, Jim, thank you all. And coming up, live pictures now of the situation in Tel Aviv, where mass protests have been raging for hours after the Israeli parliament passed a key part of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's controversial judicial overhaul plan. We are on the ground in Jerusalem with the latest. Plus, see you in court, Mr. President. That's how Texas Governor Greg Abbott is responding to new legal pressure from the Justice Department over controversial floating barriers that the administration is calling both illegal and unsafe. The latest on that story ahead. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back, and you are looking at live pictures in Tel Aviv as thousands of protesters take to the streets after Israel's parliament passed a controversial law overhauling the country's judicial system. This was the scene just moments ago as demonstrators took to the streets, clashing with authorities and setting fires in downtown Tel Aviv as the protests intensify. Ahead of the vote today, I should say, demonstrators gathered waving Israeli flags and blocking the streets to the Knesset while police deployed water cannons as they tried to disperse the crowd. The new law, which passed 64-0 after opposition members boycotted the vote, puts limits on the Supreme Court's ability to strike down decisions made by government ministers, and it's just the beginning phase of Netanyahu's planned judicial overhaul. Yesterday, in an unusual move, President Biden weighed in on the internal politics of Israel, calling the proposal, quote, divisive. And in a new statement today following the vote, Biden said it was unfortunate and urged leaders to build consensus through political dialogue. Joining me now is NBC News foreign correspondent Raf Sanchez. He is in Jerusalem, and NBC News White House correspondent Ali Rafa. Raf, let's start with you. Tell us, what is the latest on the ground in Israel?
Well, Ryan, Israel is tonight a divided country, perhaps more divided than it has ever been in its 75-year history. You can see behind me on the streets of Jerusalem, there are now some few dozen protesters who are blocking this main road. Earlier tonight, there were tens of thousands, and there were Israeli police using water cannon to try to disperse them. These protesters say they will stay on the streets, and in their words, they will continue the fight for democracy. We have heard a lot of anger, a lot lot of fear about this country's future from these protesters. But there is another half of Israel, the half that voted for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his far-right government, and they are celebrating tonight because they have felt for a long time that the unelected judges of the Supreme Court were standing in the way of the policies favored by the conservative majority of citizens in Israel. And Netanyahu, speaking to his public earlier tonight, says that what he did was not undermining democracy. He says it is the essence of democracy because it puts power back in the hands of the government. Either way, Ryan, a country deeply, deeply divided, and it is not clear right now how it comes back together.
And of course, this is just the first stage of these overhauls. What other forms of judicial reform can we expect the Knesset to take up?
Right, so there are kind of two outstanding policies that we have yet to see what's going to happen with them. One, the most controversial, there was originally a plan under which Parliament could vote by a simple majority to ignore rulings of the Israeli Supreme Court. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said he has put that policy to the side. He says he has no plans of reviving it, but his opponents do not trust him. They feel that Netanyahu has moved the goalposts over and over again over the course of these negotiations. The other outstanding issue is the question of how judges are appointed. It's a little bit technical, Ryan. I'll spare you all the details, but the government here wants to take more control over the committee, which is tasked with actually appointing judges to the Supreme Court. The opposition says that is an absolute red line, that judges need to be appointed by consensus. We will see in the coming weeks which parts, if any, of this rest of the judicial package Netanyahu plans to take up.
And of course, this all comes at a time where Netanyahu himself is dealing with some health problems. He just got fitted for a pacemaker today. How is he doing, and are there still some lingering concerns about his health?
Yeah, Ryan, it's pretty extraordinary. Netanyahu was released from hospital here in Jerusalem earlier this morning, and he pretty much went straight to the floor of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, where he was presiding over this floor vote. Netanyahu is 73 years old. He generally seems to be in pretty good health, but this is the second trip he has made to the hospital in a week. As you said, he was fitted with a pacemaker after suffering what his doctors said was arrhythmia and irregular heartbeat. He says he's fine. He addressed the nation earlier on, and we saw him counting the votes, twisting arms, cajoling, and facing up to his opponents. So he seems, at least, to be a man in good health. But as you said, there are questions over his situation. Right? Okay,
Raf Sanchez live in Jerusalem. Stay safe, Raf. Let's go now to Ali Rafa, who's at the White House. So, Ali, I should say. A little bit of an out-of-the-ordinary statement by the White House and the president to get involved in a foreign political battle like this. What are they saying about this latest move by Netanyahu and his far-right coalition? Doesn't this really already complicate the situation and the relationship that Biden has with Bibi Netanyahu?
Yeah, Ryan, it's very rare for U.S. presidents to so publicly weigh in on the internal affairs of these countries that are our closest allies. But this relationship between the president and Prime Minister Netanyahu is anything but conventional. And now so is this ongoing crisis. We saw, as Raf reported, Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly ignoring that request from President Biden that they talked about in their phone call last week, that he echoed in that statement this weekend, where he asked Netanyahu to wait to get broad support for this judicial proposal to avoid exactly the scenes we're seeing play out in Jerusalem, as you saw Raf reporting on there. But now the White House is saying in a statement today, quote, "We understand talks are ongoing and likely to continue over the coming weeks and months to forge a broader compromise." They add the United States will continue to support the efforts of President Herzog and other Israeli leaders as they seek to build a broader consensus through political dialogue. White House officials are saying that dialogue with Israeli counterparts is ongoing, but they didn't have any details about any specific calls planned between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So this situation is really putting a spotlight on this diplomatic tightrope that the president is walking right now. He and Netanyahu have known each other for decades. They're on opposite ends of the political spectrum, but obviously the president wants to be able to protect this long-standing alliance the U.S. has with Israel because of what's at stake here. We're talking militarily. militarily. Israel is the #1 recipient of U.S. military aid. There are concerns that, the president is facing pressure to potentially cut the amount of aid sent to Israel because of its treatment of Palestinians. And in light of this situation, the potential democratic direction this country is going to take. And then you add to that the foreign policy implications here. There are concerns that any instability in this region could potentially trigger more escalation in other Middle Eastern countries that the U.S. has a presence in. So there's a lot of layers to this, Ryan, and it certainly cannot be underscored the pressure the president is under to have some sort of impact or intervene here, while he definitely knows that his powers to do that are very limited.
All right, R-Fla, thank you for the update there from the White House. Let's bring now in Ambassador Dennis Ross, a former special assistant to President Obama and the Middle East coordinator under President Clinton. So, Ambassador, what's going to happen now in Israel? Could the Supreme Court strike down this law? Could we be on the verge of a constitutional crisis in that country?
Well, there's no question that there's already been a petition brought to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court could well strike down this law, in which case then the prime minister would have to decide, what does he do? Does he respect the ruling of the Supreme Court? Does he defy it? If he defies it, what do different members of the government do? I think that's an open question as to what would happen. Anyone who would, I think, would hazard a prediction of what would happen at that point has sort of ignored what's been happening in Israel over the last several weeks and months, including the discussions that took place to the very last minute to try to forge a compromise. The compromise, by the way, broke down not over the content of what the new reasonability provision could be. There basically was a readiness to agree to scale back the conditions or the criteria on which it would apply, and the opposition was prepared to accept that. But where there was a divide was over how long you would put the rest of any discussion of the judicial process on hold. And the divide was between 5 months that the government was prepared to accept and 15 months that the opposition was seeking. Obviously, if there was a higher degree of trust, you probably could have found some bridge between those two positions on the time frame. In any case, the point is there's not a lot of trust between the government and the opposition, number one. Number two, the Supreme Court is going to hear this in all likelihood. If it does make a decision, then the real challenge for Prime Minister Netanyahu is, does he respect what the court decides? And it will be, in your words, a constitutional crisis, but we haven't seen that yet, so we don't know quite how it will unfold.
So talk to me a little bit about the public sentiment there. Obviously, these pictures show that this move by Netanyahu appears to be deeply unpopular. Is that reflected among the broader view within Israel? And if so, if it is a deeply unpopular move, is this how a responsible democracy acts? You said that they were close to a deal, and then when it fell apart, they just pushed through what they were looking for. Are we at an inflection point right now for Israel's democracy?
Well, obviously, the people in the street feel that way. And we're in the 29th week of people protesting in numbers that are unlike anything we've ever seen in our country. In many respects, what it shows is how deep the democratic ethos is in Israel. This is a grassroots movement, and somehow it's carried on this way. Many of the people within the government were convinced that after a couple weeks, these protests would wane. Then they were convinced that when it became summer and it became hot, the protests would disappear. We saw tens of thousands of people march 40 miles uphill in 95-degree heat from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So the depth of feeling is quite strong among those who are opposed to it. Are there people who support the reform process? There are. This is a divided country right now. My guess is it's nearly 50-50 in terms of attitudes for or against the reform, but it isn't 50-50 when it comes to what the process should be. The polls show consistently 60 to 70% of the Israeli public believe while there should be some reform of the judicial system, they also believe it should be done through a process of dialogue and consensus. So I think the government decision will not be a popular one. I suspect when Prime Minister Netanyahu says, look, we're prepared now, let's spend the next 5 months discussing what can be done on the rest of the judicial reform proposals, I suspect what that reflects is a desire on his part to try to calm the temperature, calmly attitudes, and see if over a period of time, if you take a step back, you will see attitudes begin to change. I suspect on the key provisions of this, like the override provision, which he has shelved, but also on the issue of the judges' selection, who picks the judges, what's the makeup of the committee, that I think is going to be the next real focal point. And the real question will be, will we see a resumption of discussions under the aegis of the president of Israel, President Herzog? Some of the opposition doesn't want to engage in that. Other members of the opposition seem to think that probably they should engage in that. That's the next thing to be watching for.
Okay, and we should point out those are live pictures of the situation in Tel Aviv. We see some fireworks being set off there. Just quickly before we go, Ambassador, we only have about 30 seconds. How does this impact the relationship with President Biden? President Biden had said that he had hoped to invite Bibi Netanyahu to the United States for a visit in the near future. Does this now delay that visit? Does it make the tensions between those two men even greater?
Well, I think President Biden will want to continue to draw a distinction between his support for Israel and this particular set of proposals. I don't believe that he will want to have an early meeting with the Prime Minister. He'll want to have some assurance from the Prime Minister about what's going to happen with these proposals. Already you have the Prime Minister suggesting he's ready to have discussions last at least until November. I think he feels in that context it will create an environment where it becomes easier for President Biden to invite him to the White House.
Okay, excellent insight. Former Ambassador Dennis Ross, we appreciate you being on with us. Thank you so much. And then
My pleasure.
Up next, Texas takes on Washington. We'll have the latest on an escalating legal and humanitarian fight between Governor Greg Abbott and the Department of Justice. But first, in today's Meet the Press Minute, a look back at Israel's long fight for independence. Here's then Foreign Minister Golda Meir in 1956, reflecting on conflict with Egypt and her nation's enduring struggle for self-determination.
Madam Minister, do you believe that the Arab nations wish to destroy Israel as a state? Is that what you mean?
To my sorrow, yes.
Yes. I believe President Nasser has so stated rather recently.
Recently, and a year ago, and a half a year ago, and he states that quite often.
How do you think that Israel can be maintained in the midst of a hostile population on all sides?
Mrs. Gregg, maybe it is easier for us to understand it than for others. Because throughout Jewish history, if the Jewish people went out of existence just because other peoples wanted them to go out of existence, there wouldn't be a Jewish people today, and there wouldn't be an Israel today. But there is a certain stubbornness about our people that we just want to live the same as other people do. So we've lived among nations that didn't like us, and now we live in an area as an independent state where people don't like us. We hope temporarily.
And welcome back. Texas Governor Greg Abbott remains defiant after the Justice Department threatened legal action if the state refused to commit to taking down a series of floating barriers along the border meant to deter migrants from crossing the Rio Grande. DOJ gave Texas a deadline of 2 o'clock this afternoon. The legal threat comes after disturbing allegations of, quote, inhumane treatment of migrants were brought to light earlier this month. The allegations came from a border officer sounding the alarm in an email to his superiors. The officer said the state was using concerta wire wrapped around barrels to halt migrants and that a teenage boy broke his leg trying to navigate it. The Texas Department of Safety denied the accusation and told NBC News there is no wire in the river, just on the banks. NBC News correspondent Priscilla Thompson has this report from the Texas border.
Yeah, that deadline has come and gone. And as you can see, those buoys are still in the Rio Grande behind me. To be clear, the Department of Justice gave Governor Abbott until 2 p.m. Eastern time to commit to removing those buoys. But what we've seen from Governor Abbott is effectively a doubling down on his position today. He sent a letter to President Biden saying that Texas has a U.S. constitutional right to have sovereign authority over protecting its borders. He also hit on something that the DOJ mentioned in their letter to him about this Rivers and Harbors Act, which the DOJ says he is in violation of because he did not get approval from the federal government, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, before placing this buoy in the water. But Abbott says that buoys are not something that are covered under this act, and so therefore he believes that he is on good legal standing to fight this, and that is exactly what he intends to do. So we are anxiously awaiting to see what exactly is going to happen here next. But I will tell you, as it relates to the issue of migration and what we've seen here in the time that we've been here, we have seen people simply walking around the buoys, walking past the buoys. They're 1,000 feet long. That's about the length of 3 football fields. We also saw a man who jumped over in between 2 buoys. And so it would appear that people are still finding ways to cross. And this is something that advocates have brought up, saying that this buoy is not going to stop people from crossing. It is only going to make it potentially more dangerous, potentially more deadly if folks might try to swim under them and could potentially drown. But I also spoke to the Department of Public Safety, Lieutenant Christopher Olivares, as these buoys were being installed. And he said that any barrier is going to be a good deterrent and a vital tool for law enforcement officers who are out here. And I did reach out to him to ask him about some of the things that we have been seeing today in terms of folks still finding a way to make it across. But unfortunately, we have not yet heard back from him. Guys, back to you.
Okay, Priscilla, thank you. And we do have some breaking news just in from the Justice Department. They've officially filed a civil complaint against Texas in this dispute. The Justice Department demanding that Texas remove those structures at their own expense. And turning now to the extreme weather and deadly heat, which are still plaguing the globe today. In the western U.S., the heat is not letting up as temperatures once again hit record highs. Salt Lake City reached 106 degrees and Phoenix reached a blazing 118 degrees on Saturday. Sunday also marked the 24th straight day temperatures in the city have climbed above 110 degrees. There is a little bit of good news, though. While more than 59 million Americans still remain under heat alerts today, that number is about half of what it was at the beginning of the weekend. Up north, more flooding hit New England this weekend as you're watching as water rushed down the stairs inside of Boston's iconic Fenway Park. Even further north, 4 people, including 2 children, are missing in Canada after intense thunderstorms also caused flash flooding in Nova Scotia. The rains came after Canada's Atlantic region was plagued with wildfires earlier this summer. Similar wildfires are still raging across Greece. Footage from this weekend shows billowing smoke and flames on the island of Rhodes as tourists and locals were forced to evacuate. And after the break, spoiler alert, inside Democrats' growing fears of a third-party presidential candidate potentially derailing Biden's 2024 bid. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As Republicans their focus, I should say, remains squarely on the 2024 primary, some Democrats are already looking ahead to the general election and a potential spoiler for President Biden, a third-party candidate. The group No Labels has begun to make its case for a third-party presidential bid. They're working to get on the ballot in all 50 states. And a prominent moderate Democrat and a frequent thorn in Biden's side has said he's not ruling out a run on their ticket.
Are you considering running for president on the No Labels third-party ticket?
We're not considering anything about running for any office.
Are you taking it off the table?
We're
running
not
for
taking
president?
anything off the table. Washington's divided. The politics is dividing the country, making you pick a side. There's only one side, the American side. And that's where people want to be.
So if you believe that, and if that's where the American public is, would you be open to running for a third-party presidential ticket?
Let's see where everybody goes. Let's see what happens. Maybe they'll come to their senses and start doing the job they were elected to do.
Joining me now is Amy Walter, the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report. Amy, I'm not going to ask you to analyze whether or not Joe Biden changing the part in his hair, or Joe Manchin changing the part in his hair is indicative, is a sign of something to come. But you did write a very fascinating piece for the Cook Political Report. At the risk of having people not read it, I need you to answer the question of the title. How seriously should we take a potential No Labels candidate?
Well, anytime you come off of a presidential race like we did in 2020, where the winner basically succeeded by winning 40,000 votes, essentially, winning the election by 40,000 votes spread over 3 states, that is the difference between Joe Biden winning the Electoral College and Donald Trump winning the Electoral College. Obviously, 4 years earlier, it was about 79,000 votes that separated Donald Trump from winning the Electoral College and Hillary Clinton winning the Electoral College. So Every vote matters. That said, I don't know that we have a really good sense for what a candidate on a no labels ticket would do to the race. Would they siphon some vote off? Absolutely. Would it all come from Biden? I'm not 100% convinced that that's the case, partly because I think there are a lot of voters out there who do see what Joe Manchin mentioned. They're frustrated with their choice. They think Washington's broken, but they know these two candidates pretty well, unlike 2016. And the idea that they are just simply going to say, well, I'm going to go with the third party candidate because I think this candidate is a centrist and all those people happen to be Democrats, that may not really be the case.
I mean, is part of that because we don't know who the candidates may be? I mean, we're talking, could be Joe Manchin, could be John Huntsman.
It could be somebody else. So the way this is why I mentioned the way that we poll this question. Both the No Labels group, those opposed to no labels, and even some public polls ask the question like this. Would you consider voting for an independent candidate? Would you consider voting for a moderate independent candidate? Sure. Lots of people would say yes to that, right? That sounds great.
Right.
There's not really a downside to that. But then when you fill in the name, that person no longer is whatever you want them to be. My version of an independent moderate may look very different from yours. Once that person gets named, well, they have a party, they have a voting record, in the case of Joe Manchin, of course, and they have an identity that's going to make it hard to put them just in this category of this is going to be a third, another way forward.
Right. And it's interesting, you're kind of alluding to this, but maybe if you can put a finer point on it, this idea of wanting to shake up the system, that the things that Joe Manchin is talking about, people do want to see Washington work better. Is it different when Donald Trump isn't in the equation? Do you not necessarily want to take the risk of sending a message to Washington if you have someone as divisive as him as one of the options?
So think about 2016, the number of voters who picked Jill Stein or the Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson. You go state by state, Democrats say, see, that's why we lost. Right. All of those voters would have come to us. And the polling taken after the 2020 election basically confirms that. Most of the 2016 third-party voters ended up voting for Joe Biden in 2020. So, yes, I understand that worry if you are Democrats that those people who are dissatisfied are going to hurt your party. I think the bigger problem, though, if we're looking at what should be a bigger concern for Democrats right now, it's that Donald Trump is not the nominee. Right. Anytime we talk about Donald Trump, and that's a good point that you raised, Ryan, that people know who Donald Trump is, even for people who aren't particularly excited or engaged with Joe Biden, they know what the alternative would be. Put another candidate in there that's not named Donald Trump, and now the equation gets a little more complicated.
I want you to see what Lisa Murkowski, the moderate Republican from Alaska, said about a potential Manchin candidacy. Listen.
And Alaskans are saying, can you talk Joe into running? That's not for me to do. I do think about what a third party will bring to the equation. I tell you, if it's a matchup between Biden and Trump, I know exactly where I'd go. I would go with Joe Manchin. I am one who doesn't like to use my vote for the lesser of evils. I want to be proactive in who I think could do the job. I think Manchin could do the job. But will our system allow for that? That I don't know.
Unfortunately, you don't have a lot of time to react to
this, but she's the perfect,
there, right?
She's the perfect example of, while we talk about who these swing voters might be in 2020 as being the folks who voted for Trump and then Biden in 2020 might be attracted to a third-party candidate. There are also folks like Lisa Murkowski out there, Republicans who won't vote for Joe Biden, but they're also open to the idea of a candidate that has maybe a Republican credential.
And maybe that voter
or more
just,
moderate
if there isn't that option, maybe that voter just sits out, doesn't vote for anybody. Right?
Yep.
All right, Amy Walter, excellent piece as always.
Ryan.
Thank you so much for being here. Still to come, 100 days of violence in Sudan. I'll talk to a UNICEF official about the conflict's devastating impact on children and what can be done to address the humanitarian crisis as war rages with no end in sight. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The violence in Sudan has now surpassed 100 days with no end in sight. The fight between the military and the paramilitary group has killed at least 3,000 people, according to Sudanese officials. Millions have been displaced, according to the UN. This comes just 2 weeks after the UN's Secretary General warned that the country could be on the brink of a full-scale civil war. And as UNICEF reports that severe violations of children's rights are a, quote, hourly occurrence. With me now is Joe English, and he's a spokesperson for UNICEF. Joe, thank you for being here. And for people that haven't been following the developments in Sudan, explain what has been unfolding there for the past 3 months.
Yeah, it has been 100 days of absolute horror. You know, many kids here in the US are currently on their summer vacations, and we know as children that, you know, those good times can feel like they last a lifetime, but the reverse is true. And so just trying to imagine what it must be for children and families who 100 days ago woke up to the sounds of guns, the sounds of artillery, you know, and maybe they thought that this would last a couple of days. Now, here we are over 3.5 months later, and there is no end in sight. All across the country, you know, families' lives have been turned upside down. We know that over 400 children have been killed, more than 2,000 children injured in the violence. But this is going to be a low estimate because there are parts of the country that there's a communication blackout, there's a lack of access. We just aren't able to get in and verify these numbers. And so it's a nightmare on a daily basis. And children wake up every day and they are scared. Families are making impossible decisions of whether to flee their homes, to leave everything they know behind in search of safety. But where do they go? We know that hundreds of thousands have fled the border into Chad, and that's from Darfur, where we have an idea of what's going on there, but the situation seems desperate, and ultimately children need peace, and they need it as soon as possible.
You mentioned that you've had difficulty getting into the region. So what has UNICEF been able to do to try and help these children that are in such a dire situation?
We are reaching children. We're reaching children with safe drinking water, with nutrition. You know, where children and families may have crossed the border, we're reaching them with psychosocial support to be able to unpack some of the experiences that they've gone through, and with education. You know, but the reality is that whilst fighting continues, there are areas that we just cannot reach, and so we need the guns to fall silent. We need a meaningful pause in the fighting, at the very least, if not a full ceasefire. You know, and we need to be guaranteed that we can have that access. But that's not going to be enough. You know, funding is absolutely critical as well. And small amounts, you know, the amount that, you know, a regular person in the street could donate could actually make a huge difference. There are hundreds of thousands of children in Sudan who are malnourished, who just don't have enough to eat. And UNICEF is there. We know how to treat these children. And something so simple as a high-protein paste made out of peanuts can be the difference between life and death. You know, and that costs a couple of dollars. So, you know, anyone who's out there who wants to help, it's possible. It can feel overwhelming. It can feel demoralizing. You know, but organizations like UNICEF, the UN, NGOs, you know, if you are able to support, it makes a difference and it saves children's lives.
So to that end, are you getting the type of support from the United States and other Western allies that you need? And how much can the average person do?
The US government's always a huge supporter of UNICEF's work. They're our biggest donor for our humanitarian aid. But the reality is that there is never enough. You know, I mean, Sudan is now 100 days. You know, we all know about the crisis in Ukraine, the food insecurity in the Horn of Africa. You know, we respond to every single one of these crises. Wherever there are children in need, we will be there. We will be providing that support. But ultimately, we need more funding, you know, and so if you know, anyone there watching at home does want to support, unicefusa.org/donate, the smallest amount can make a huge difference. But ultimately, what children need is they need a peaceful solution to this, because until then, all we are able to provide is a temporary respite, you know, and we want these kids to be able to go back to their normal lives, to be able to go back to school, you know, and start building for a better future.
Right. You mentioned the need to find some sort of breakthrough in terms of a ceasefire or something along those lines. Do you have any encouraging signs that a diplomatic, you know, solution can, at least a temporary solution, could happen in the near future?
I mean, we hope so. We hope so on a daily basis. Sadly, you know, we have seen a number of ceasefires agreed that have not held. For UNICEF, our focus is always the children, and we hope that that can be something that everyone can agree on. Even within war, there are rules. We are, any party to conflict is supposed to keep children safe, keep them out of harm's way, ensure that schools and hospitals and the critical civilian infrastructure that families rely on is kept separate from the fighting. And sadly, we continue to see that is not the case in Sudan. And so, there are many things that the children in Sudan need. Peace is paramount, but the list goes to education, to safe drinking water, to protection. There's so much need.
Okay, Joe English, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. We appreciate you being here. And thank you for being with us this hour. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but our NBC News Now coverage continues right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.